Hey there, I'm Vickie Howell. Welcome to episode 11 of Craftish, a podcast for conversations with creative types from all walks of crafty life. So I recently decided to get my big girl blogger pants back on by stopping the pattern I've slipped into over the past couple of years of solely taking photos on my iPhone. And my new camera just came in the mail, and so as soon as I learn how to use it, you can expect to be dazzled by my craft project photography. Or at least mildly interested. Fortunately, there's a creative live course I'm about to dive into that's focused on the exact camera I bought, so I have pretty high hopes that I'll be an expert by the end of the day, which seems totally reasonable. Anyway, I've had the craft of photography on my brain these days, which brings me to this week's guest, James Beard award-winning photographer Jody Horton. From former presidents' portraits to food blogs, Jody's lifestyle photography has been featured internationally. He's traveled worldwide to work on campaigns ranging from Jack Daniels and Ritz-Carlton to Ferrari and the Food Network, capturing with his camera the essence of each experience. And back when I could still afford him, he also did the photography for a couple of my knitting books. Jody and his family are also some of our family's closest friends, so it's absolutely my pleasure to introduce him to you now. Friend, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So I've been around you obviously many times, but in totally different situations, at parties, on sets, both video and photography, in smaller gatherings. And I've noticed, regardless of where you are, whether it's work or social, you seem to approach the situation in the same way. You're always very much interested in the people around you, whether or not you know them at all, or if they're just somebody walking into your life. And you really delve in a way that I haven't seen very often into finding out people's stories. Is that the impetus for you for your creative process, or is it just inherently who you are?
I haven't given that much thought, but I guess that's certainly an aspect of it. I think that really, I guess I've thought about it more in terms of knowing what people are passionate about. I feel like that probably more often is something that I'm at least consciously drawn to. I think if people are doing something that they're passionate about, that can be really compelling to try to capture in some way, whether it be an editorial or documentary type of project or even a commercial project. So when I think about what would drive me abstractly, I would be more likely to move or to describe my interest as being wanting to connect with people that feel strongly about what they do and passionate about what they do, rather than being necessarily inherently interested in like any person, I guess. I don't know how that sounds.
I don't know. I think you are interested in any person, though. I've seen you, talk to people about whatever, talk to my husband's dad about, where he lives and what it's like there and what the culture's like there. And you weren't scouting him for a project. You just seemed genuinely interested in people, and maybe you're not even conscious of it, but it seems like you're always delving to find little bits and pieces.
That's probably true. I guess that's, I guess that general curiosity led me to study anthropology eventually. I guess it's kind of inherent within an interest for language to some degree, like just communicating and kind of understanding little nuances of things are interesting to me. I think I'd have to get into more specific examples before I could maybe get a handle on where that comes from exactly. But
you have a degree in anthropology, but really it's a specialty of anthropology, correct?
Well, yes. The degree was in cultural anthropology. I had a specialization within that specialization of visual anthropology. But I think that most people probably don't have a, like anthropology as a whole can encompass archaeology as well. So this would be, the study of human culture. So that's pretty broad still, obviously. And then the subspecialty of visual anthropology kind of has two parts. It would be, it could be interpreted, I guess, in two ways. One, visual anthropology can refer to just the medium that one might be working in. So that would mostly apply to anything that I could do that was anthropological or quasi-anthropological in its nature. And it can also refer to using visual mediums that might be culturally generated as the thing that is studied. And that might mean, for instance, studying like stitching patterns, for instance, that are traditional, or the way in which some material good was made traditionally, and what sort of meaning it might have within the process, or what patterns have been accepted, what symbols it might embody, that type of thing.
Right.
Is that very clear?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just curious to know if I'm curious to know if you've always been curious. Were you a curious child?
I think so. Yeah, I think probably maybe even more as a kid. I probably was a kid that was asking a lot of questions and was trying to soak up, just in general, soak up knowledge around him. Yeah, I guess that's accurate. I don't know if it was, I was to an extreme in that manner, but yeah, I guess I almost can't imagine really like what life would be like if you weren't curious. I mean, it's like that would be it. When I think about my own boys, I think, there's no excuse in the world to ever be bored, because there's so many things to be interested in. Probably more than anything, that can be, I guess now you're saying that could be something that's driving to my work, but it probably was in many ways something almost to overcome in terms of finding some type of focus in a career, because I'm, probably by 10 years ago, let's say, I'm 43. 10 years ago, I would have, if someone had said, well, what do you want to do? Like, what's your career going to be? I was still really struggling with that and still trying to figure out what direction I would go in. And, I was interested in music. I was interested in documentary film. I had interest in graphic design, architecture, writing, and like, in a ideal world, we could all live long enough lives to be able to realize all of the things that might interest us fully. But I had to truly make like a concerted effort to try to narrow what I would theoretically do and like what I would be interested in to something that was more finite. And I really had to work hard to say, okay, I'm just going to try to focus on this pursuit of photography, even though photography itself is really kind of a cheat, because you get to delve into these different, whatever it may be that you're interested in, and kind of explore that for little periods of time. But even in specializing in that very flexible medium, it was difficult to come to that level of commitment with it.
I mean, I don't think that's a cheat. I think it's like well played, my friend. I mean, you get a little bit of everything by the career that you've created for yourself. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I wanted to touch a little bit on what you were talking about as, curiosity being the cure of boredom. And I think that rings so true for any person who's creative. And it makes me pause and believe that at the very core of creativity, whatever that ethos is, that it starts with curiosity. Do you find that? If you're creative, if you're curious, you're going to try things. You're going to see how things make, how they come, how they are viewed before your eyes. What happens if you do X, Y, Z?
Sure. No, that makes sense. kind of on a base level, I think that makes a lot of sense.
10 years ago, so I met you probably 12 years ago, and I remember, I don't think that I realized that you were struggling with what you were going to do. I remember you struggling in the same way we all were with how you were going to make a living, which I think aren't always, the same.
Same thing, sure.
But I remember you were making one and or two documentaries, and I remember how brutal the grants process was for you.
That's true.
And simultaneously, you were also shooting weddings to pay the bills.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And you were shooting, and then you would shoot video, for whomever needed it, gigs here and there. Or you shot a fashion show thing that happened in Austin and a bunch of stuff. And then I remember that you one day just said, I'm like getting rid of all my video, like my video equipment. I'm done.
Yeah.
Do you remember what it was that caused you to shift?
Well, I think it was around the same moment that I was trying to describe earlier. I think, I don't know if I'm making this up, but what I believe happened was that there was really some extra pressure on the idea of earning a living after Fields was born, my oldest son. And I remember thinking, this is so hard. This, the keeping up with video is so difficult. I guess I was feeling like it really didn't suit my attention span, frankly. It was, as you were saying with the grant process, something that, you would assemble a board and then you would, write a long proposal and then hope to get, just your planning stage funded, and that might take a year, and then your production would be like another grant cycle, and maybe that would be piecemealed together with a variety of grants, and then you would try to get your finishing funds on another. And so even if you were successful at that type of work, it might be an arc of time that at the very best might be 3 years for a project.
Yeah.
And I felt like there was this, I guess I just thought, well, I can't do everything. Like I can't do everything well fast enough. And I used to think, well, eventually I'll kind of get there with all of these things at once. But I decided, I guess that was just sort of a symbolic representation of the decision that I had made. I guess to make it real, I was like, well, if I'm serious about this decision to really focus on photography, then I'm giving this up. I'm giving up keep maintaining good equipment. I'm giving up trying to keep up with video, which at that time was constantly changing. I guess it still is, but it seemed to be at a pace that was even more rapid than digital photography, which was really just kind of emerging almost at that time, I feel like, or becoming really viable at an affordable price point. I think I guess it was a combination of being generally kind of exhausted by the process that I'm describing for documentary pieces, recognizing that I needed to earn a better living to support my family, and that that long protracted process of getting grants and then doing production just really didn't suit my personality. I'm more like the type of person that could do 3 projects in a week, not 1 project in 3 years.
Right.
So.
Right. I think many photographers not start with wedding photography, because some people do that forever, but it's a very common path for photographers to shoot weddings at least at some point in their career. But you were working weddings like crazy, and that was less than a decade ago, and you went from there to books, working within Austin and then New York and then LA and now international. You've shot former presidents. I should have worded that differently. You photographed former presidents. You won a James Beard Award. You've co-authored books. That is to me, like that is the creative American dream, what you've done. And I would love to hear a little bit about that journey, about how you go from wedding photographer to shooting for Cadillac and Men's Health, and you photographed, was it George Bush Sr.?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How does that happen?
Well, first I'll say I probably, in making that shift from video and thinking about like how I would make a living with stills, I guess let me back up and say that I had really had a great time when I was in grad school running a food magazine that with a friend of mine called La Cocinita. And at the time when I was feeling like, gosh, this video is really kind of exhausting, I was missing these stories that, and mostly the joy of running that magazine was frankly doing photos for it. Because that was the most creative part. The other parts were, selling ads for it, hustling art together. The design was compelling usually, but it had to happen in such a compressed period of time that it was usually like 2 or 3 sleepless days in a row before we went to press, which had its own sort of excitement about it. But the main part that I really enjoyed was doing photos. And so when I was thinking that video might not be the right path for me, I thought back fondly of these stories that were food-driven stories that were of the kind that we were doing for this little magazine in Albuquerque, and I thought, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I felt like it was something that I had a affinity for, and I thought, maybe I'll kind of revisit that path in that past. And try some, doing some stories that are like this. At that time, I was actually interested in writing and photography, and I thought, this is how I'll do this. Is that I can write pretty well, and I'm a pretty good photographer. I thought, well, I'm not maybe great at either of these things, but combined, maybe that will give me kind of an edge because I'll be able to do both of them. Yeah. And so I kind of saw that as like my in. And I pitched a few stories to a Texas magazine called Texas Co-op Power. I think the first story that I did, it was a food story, and it was on a family out in Blumenthal, which is close to Fredericksburg, and a really cute family, maybe 3 kids, all like blonde-haired kids, and they lived this sort of idyllic seeming life with an orchard in their backyard, and they had this roadside stand. And the couple that ran it were really great people, and I loved connecting with them and learning all about the process of growing peaches and the dangers of peaches freezing, and just kind of their whole world was really interesting. So I wrote my first kind of food story and shot this food story for Texas Co-op Power, and it ended up being a cover story for them. And following that, I got connected with Edible Austin, which was just starting here, and that was really very similar to the publication that I was helping to run in Albuquerque. And so between the two of those magazines, I started to do a little bit of paid work. I also at the same time had made a concerted effort just to shoot as much as I possibly could, whether I was being paid or not. And I thought, I don't know what else this will yield, but it'll be work that I'm drawn toward and that I feel has merit to photograph. And I think if I'm drawn toward it, then I can do it well. And so I really set about kind of trying to be a bit more concerted in what I was doing, and I thought anytime that I can, through any means, I'm just going to shoot as much material that I find interesting. And I did that for maybe 2 years, and maybe 70% of it was very little pay, like being paid $150 for doing a shoot or something, to no pay, just something I would do just because I knew someone and they were doing a pig roast in their backyard or something that I would find.
So were you working weddings at the same time? How are you paying bills at this point?
Yeah, so there were weddings. I probably actually only, I doubt I would have ever shot more than probably 15 weddings ever. But then of course I wasn't really making much money, so it was probably a fairly substantial chunk of income. I still had just occasional other still jobs that were kind of random. Like if, I don't know, like a company would call and ask me to take like a group picture. I might do like holiday pictures for someone. I was doing real estate and architectural photography for a while, even though I'm not really was ever much of a architectural photographer. But for a time I was doing like realtor headshots. I had like a good.
Right, I forgot about that.
Yeah, I had a good gig with that for.
And the cheerleaders at that school that one, which was actually paid. Let's just be clear, that one was a paid gig.
That's true. Yeah, everything was really piecemeal like that.
Yeah.
For a period of at least 2 or 3 years, I remember thinking, God, every single job that I get is like a brand new experience. Like I've never done this job before, even though there have been 50 jobs before that. It was always something totally new.
Yeah, and then I threw that knitting book at you a decade ago. So all of a sudden, it was a teen book. So all of a sudden, you're dealing with both teenagers and knitwear.
Right. Yeah, it was like that. It was like that random to me. It was like, well, okay, that seems exactly right. A teen knitting book.
But it sounds like that must have in part been something that you love. I mean, that sounds like the same sort of philosophy that your entire career is based on, and how you get to explore all of these worlds now for money. But at that time, you're working towards it.
Right. No, it's true. I mean, I think well, if you're just doing, as I was in most of these things that I'm explaining, that were the kind of money jobs, not even though there weren't that much money jobs, but for those money jobs, that can be, I think, more, you just never maybe get really good at something if you're just doing it once and then you don't do it again. That's the only downside, I think, to that. I know what you mean in spirit. Like if it's new, it's exciting, but at the same time, it might be so different.
You have really, over the past, handful of years, began specializing in food. I mean, you referenced before that that's sort of where you started, but I feel like there are less and less other subjects for you and more food, and your food photography is just gorgeous and award-winning. And I'm curious to know, what is it about food that you find that draws you to it? It draws you to the visual aspect of it. What about it sort of feeds that creative fire within?
Sure. Well, in part, it's the inherent story structure that exists there, because you have, most often with most foods, you have a lot of process involved with it. And if you take it back, to where it's grown or where it grows, you've got a harvest of some kind, and that could be someone picking some chilies or harvesting oysters, and you have like all this activity of people out in the world doing something, and that's really compelling to me. And I love the process of that harvested thing then going through a cooking process. And it's just naturally kind of has it has a beginning and it has kind of an end to it. And I like that because it's a short story, which again, kind of suits my attention span. We're not talking about like planting a grape seed so it will flourish into a vine like 7 years later and yield a bottle of wine. I mean, the stories that I would get to tell could be as quickly as like someone goes out and harvests something. If it went through this whole, whole circle of story, could go from where it's being harvested in a field, say, to taken to rinsed off, taken to a kitchen, prepared, combined with other ingredients, cooked, and then it has this kind of natural finish of the thing that you're eating. And so that's compelling. I think it's what's compelling too, to go back to what I was saying earlier, is that passion that people feel about it on, perhaps on all stages of that. There could be one person, or it might just be the person who takes great pride, like the family that I was referencing earlier near Fredericksburg, that takes this great pride in producing these amazing peaches, or the person that might receive that at a restaurant that's maybe a pastry chef who has devoted their adult life to making delicious pastries and all the experimentations that go on with that, and the passion that drives them on that end. So it's those are two parts at least of what draws me to food, I guess.
Do you think that your photographs would look any different if you were to walk into the kitchen or walk onto the set and take a photo of, that beautiful apple pie, versus if before you walked onto that set, you sat down with the baker and heard about how, their life story led up to that actual pie? Since that part of the process seems to be so much part of your work, I'm wondering if it would actually be reflected in it, if that aspect of the process was extracted.
Well, it would depend. It would depend on the type of shoot, but I know what you're getting at. I find that particularly if I'm approaching a subject that I don't know very much about, it kind of can go both ways. So let's see. If it's something that I've never experienced before, a type of food that I'm unfamiliar with, or let's say it's not an apple pie. Of course, I know what an apple pie is, but let's say it's like, let's say it's some type of dessert where there's like a crust on top, right? And I might not know exactly how it's constructed. So in order to represent what it is, I need to understand fully, like, how is this made, or like, what is this supposed to look like? I think about it more in terms of, what is it about this thing that is definitive of what it is, and how would I reveal that? Mm-hmm. And I keep that in mind with, like, something that comes to mind is, like, because I was just sending a photo of a fish earlier today, but it's like, if this is a really flaky fish, and it was, in this case, I think it was like pan fried or seared or something, and you can't really appreciate what that fish is, like what the nature of that fish is, until you like pull a little bit of the side of it off and see how flaky that fish is, because that like striation of that flesh is kind of what's definitive of that type of fish. I think about those sorts of things a lot. If it's in order to better reveal what it is that I'm taking a photo of, so that you can really tell the story of that thing more completely in a photo. If it were a story that included, as part of its focus, this person, then yeah, I think that knowing them a little bit, and trying as best you can to like kind of capture a little bit of their essence in a way that feels true to them is always a goal. Sometimes you just walk in and you're tasked with just taking a picture of this pie, but sometimes, and very often, you're a typical formula might be a portrait, a food item, maybe some photo that would show a sense of place, say, if it's like an editorial piece, that's kind of usually the triple set that you're asked to do. So it's like, what does this restaurant or bakery look like? What is the get a sense of the baker, like with a conscious portrait, or them just working and being themselves, and try to capture a little bit of their essence, and then some things that they actually make.
You wrote, or you said in an article I read somewhere, that writing for you is quite painful. And is the process that you've just described, does that help for you to be able to tell the story visually so that you can avoid the writing process? Do you feel like this whole process has given you the ability to show us the story versus tell us?
Yeah, to a great degree. I mean, I think about photography as kind of being a cheat, like as I was describing it before. But in this case, I'm meaning because I first thought, even from maybe, let's say, maybe lower school, certainly by middle school, I had this thought that I might be a writer someday. I don't know why, but
did you write a lot as a child?
I did. I wrote a lot. It was something that I seemed to excel at school, and I always got great feedback from teachers. I took creative writing classes in college, this type of thing. It seemed like a very difficult type of career to pursue as a creative writer. It's like, well, where do you start there? You just kind of have to jump in and I guess do it. Doing a path of journalism didn't really have much appeal to me, but I did, as I was saying earlier, do a little bit of writing and photography early on. Actually, the first kind of pairing of those things that I did was for a college newspaper, and I did like adventure travel stories. And then after college, I lived in Costa Rica for a few years, and I did that there. I would go out. It was actually maybe one of the best sort of jobs that I ever had. I was working as a freelance person, but I would go on some adventure for a couple days. I would go like kayak a river for a couple days, or hike a mountain, or go see a volcano, or really go scuba diving. And once I did like a 5-day scuba diving a trip on a liveaboard. All these amazing things that I wanted to do, and then I would come back and turn in my film and write stories. I kind of got sidetracked there. I don't know, what are we talking about?
I think that you're just talking about curiosity and following, like, and becoming inspired. We started talking about writing, but I think that it led you. It sounds like it led you to still capturing those images visually as well.
Yeah. So it does. It takes forever. It takes forever to write.
It's brutal. It's brutal.
It's terrible. It would take me all week to write a story. I actually foolishly did this recently. I'd been hired. When was this? I guess this was in November, and this is the first story that I've written probably in 4 years. But I had the opportunity to go to Budapest and do a story for Ritz-Carlton magazine, and
they wanted you to write and photograph for it.
Yeah, and they wanted me to write it as well, and it was so counter to the experience that I'd had with other, larger magazines, where straight out the gate when I was making that changeover that I was describing, and I'd done those pieces for Texas Co-op Power, those were like kind of out of the norm because it's a smaller paper, there are smaller magazine. And they were open to me doing that. But when I approached magazines like Texas Monthly, they kind of followed the general rule that most magazines do, which is no one can do both of these things well, and at least not simultaneously. And so at first I kind of bucked that for a little bit, but then I was like, well, all right, I can just sort of tell these stories with photos alone. And so it was a surprise to me to get this solicitation to do a story as well. And I guess it had something to do with the remoteness of the trip. Yeah. Well, just that it's in Budapest. But I think also they liked the idea of this being a photographer's story. Like as I guess the construct of it was like, it's my like experience there as like a normal traveler. Like I'm just actually literally taking a vacation, and then I'm writing up my experience after that and turning in my snapshots almost. In reality, it was more complicated than that, but all this to say that it probably took me a week to write it, at least. Like I would get up early and it would take me like 4 hours, and I would get like another 100 words. It was awful.
How many words did you have to turn in?
I think it was maybe 1,200 words or something like that in the end.
Yeah. I know it could take me a whole day to write 500 words sometimes. It just depends. It depends also if I don't know if the mood is right, if using in the mood, or if the energy is right, or if I can just tell if the vibe's there or not.
Right.
Does that happen with you?
Yeah. I think you either have the flow or you don't.
Yeah. You talked about writing as a kid. With your boys, do you encourage them to write or to be creative in any way?
Yeah. I mean, so much of what I'm trying to think of what, so much of verbally, I think we do all the time. I think that's just sort of, I think there's a lot of wordplay around the house, and just that sort of joking is kind of part of our everyday life.
Your witty banter.
Yes.
That the Horton family is known for. Yeah.
That's right. And, there's so much that happens that's related to school that it's hard to put more on top of that.
Sure.
Although, Fields particularly is such an avid reader. Like he just loves exploring like that. And other than that, it's probably like a lot of building of things, whether it's certainly throughout the lives of the kid. There's probably both of the kids. There's been many hundreds of hours playing with Legos and constructing things like that.
You also always have like the stockpile of wood that follows you from wherever you go, in both the homes that you've owned and in your workshop that you I've seen you just build things with them in general, like a makeshift little house or whatever.
Yeah, I do love wood. I've tried to in more recent years to stick with like designing stuff more and like conceiving of them and figuring that part out and getting a drawing together, being able to convey that to someone else, just because it requires so much time.
You're busy. You have to outsource now.
That's right. So, but I'm still really gratified by, imagining something that I would want and then having someone else actually execute that. So,
for years you had a at-home studio.
True.
And just recently you've bought a big studio space. How, if at all, has that affected your work-life balance? Is it easier not being at home working, or is it harder because you're not at home also physically at home as much?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't know yet. I feel like, and it's too early to tell in a way, because we just moved into the new studio in January, in the middle of January. So here we are, not too many months following. And there was so much work that frankly, it's continued since, just that's involved with improving the space, fixing this and that. So at least for now, there's been so much energy put into the creation of it that then that can be draining in some ways, although it can be very fulfilling as well. It will be more interesting to see like where I am once that's kind of at a baseline, like, hey, this is where you work, not this is where you're constantly making 30 decisions on construction or a day also. But I don't know if this is tied to that or not, but probably just the pressure of, as we renovated a house and studio like at the same time, which was just a terrible idea.
It's a terrible idea.
Yeah. But
they look so good.
Yeah, they've turned out well, but man, I wouldn't do it again.
And we should sidebar that you have the most phenomenal partner in your wife.
It's true.
Who has helped level out this balance by giving all of her time to family time to fully support both of these like ventures.
That's true. Yeah, she's amazing.
Carry on. I just had to give Reagan props really quickly.
No, thank you. And, but yeah, I think at least in the last maybe handful of weeks, we're kind of emerging from this place of being like totally, having to be wrapped up in all the construction things and details, and have kind of got past some of the at least the majority of the push on this building. And I've been more concerted with trying to set, boundaries with having a better work-life balance and being as present as I can be at home. And yeah, it is both good and bad to have your work place a little bit removed. Now, bear in mind, this is not like it's 20 minutes away. It's like 7 minutes away. So it's easy enough to get there. It can be so convenient to be able to go up and just do something you have to do like literally for 5 minutes. And I can miss that sometimes. This just happened, Saturday, I think, or I had to send a file to someone, and then I set it on send, and then I came home, and I was like, great, I'm done for the weekend. And then I realized later, because I didn't get a sent confirmation, that something went wrong. So I had to like go back to the office.
Right, instead of just running upstairs.
So it can be nice to feel separated at once, but really the nature of photography is that you have to be pretty available most of the time. So I don't know. Maybe ask me again in another year. I think overall quality of life higher because the space itself is so much better. How that plays in with the work-life balance, I'm not entirely sure of yet.
Yeah. Before I wrap up, we spent a lot of time talking about food photography. I wanted to touch just a little bit on your photography that you've done of actual people. And I was wondering if when you shoot people, especially if they're well-known people, you did the cover of didn't you do the James Carville cover too?
Yes.
You shot, if you shoot something like that with he and his wife, or, we mentioned the Bushes earlier, are you able to still work with the same process as you would, with a baker we referenced earlier, where even though the subject is the pie or whatever it is, you're sort of, in a way, interviewing the maker of it. But when when the subject is the actual person being that you are photographing, do you still try and get a little bit of information about them from them? Do you try to engage in conversation, or have they set those like hard boundaries, especially when they're celebrities, that is, not going to happen?
Well, I think it can go both ways. It's really dependent on the situation, and I can't say that I have 50 examples of that I can pull
the two
from.
that I listed.
But
How about those two?
Yeah, even those. And so those are polar opposites, in fact, in some ways. So, for instance, with photographing George and Barbara Bush, that was that had to be done in like less than 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And so we had to really choose exactly where we're going to set up. It was my assistant, Sean, and I.
Remind me what this was for. Was it for a magazine?
This was actually for a Garden and Gun piece. And it was a profile of Houston and it various restaurants and museums and this sort of thing, as well as influential people that were kind of like represented the character of the city. So anyway, we had to make a special trip to go back because the Bush's schedule is like so difficult and tight. It's like, no, it can't be either any of these 4 days when we're going to already be in Houston. It has to be like the next Monday. So we have to drive back down expressly for this. It's like, okay. And then we, have a contact from their handler, essentially, who's like, okay, the Bushes are doing this, we're on schedule for this. Okay, great. Okay, now it looks like they're going to be delayed. Can you, wait before you come to the house? Yes. And so then we get there, and we really have maybe certainly less than 10 minutes to figure out exactly how it's going to be framed. And, as usual, it involved like moving a piece of furniture into another place, kind of getting things out of the way, kind of setting a little bit of a scene. And we came to realize just in speaking with the handler that George Bush is relatively fragile, actually, physically. And so the thought was, hey, you're only going to have a couple minutes, and you're only going to have one location, because first he was like, would you like to be inside or outside? And I said, well, maybe we could start inside because it's warm, but maybe then we can go outside. No, that's not going to happen.
Quick and dirty, get it done.
So it's like, okay, so you really choose your whole frame. And in this case, we had no time to really communicate with George and Barbara, but they're professionals at this. They're fantastic, and so they wheeled George in and sat him on the stoop, and then Barbara was quite spry, and she came and joined, and they had their dogs and stuff with them. I was able to speak a little bit with Barbara afterwards, and she was really funny and engaging, but I didn't have that opportunity to really be with them before. And I didn't know, it could be that she would have just scooted out of the room. It could have gone either way, but she was kind of a character, and she hung out for a minute and spoke. But it didn't really necessarily inform how we were going to go about
how you shot the photo. Right. It was more circumstance. What about with James Carville?
With James Carville, that was a really sort of a strange situation.
Was this the cover of the book that he wrote with his wife?
That's right. And yes, and so Mary was really very approachable, and she was also, an interesting character, just as you would expect her to be. And I got to speak with her a good bit. But James seemed very kind of distracted and just kind of ADD, really. Like he was just kind of moving all over the place and couldn't really sit still. And he would like when I was just before I was going to go take his photo, he decided to go on a run. So he comes.
What do you mean?
He just goes on a run.
Just hold on for a second?
Does whatever. Yeah, he does whatever he wants to do at the moment. So he comes back and he's like just sweating.
Yeah.
He's sweating profusely, and then he goes and takes a shower, but he still has that, residual heat or whatever you have.
Did that feel like an utter disregard for your time, or it didn't matter because you were being paid for the time anyway?
It didn't really matter. It just seemed counterproductive. I was just like, oh man.
And what does Mary say while this is happening? And this, by the way, is Mary Madeline, his wife, and they're very entertaining because they have absolute opposite political views, but they're both political speakers.
Right. She's pretty easygoing. She was probably drinking a drink and smoking a cigarette and just sort of
used
kind of rolling her eyes a little bit.
Yeah. Which, by the way, is probably why their marriage works. That dynamic.
Right. But they're both very interesting, engaging people. But I actually spent a good bit of time there because they had, but it was really kind of after the photo, because James really didn't kind of come in. He just kind of showed up, and he was, he was like a kid. He just didn't want to stand still. He was kind of the first thing he said was okay, are we done? Are we done?
Yeah.
Is this good? And
do you think he's uncomfortable being in front of the camera?
Maybe that's it. Yeah. I think he just,
If you put those two experiences side to side and just look at them through a creative lens, do they feel different creatively for you? If you were to look at both of the photographs, the final photographs for both of those, would they feel different to you? Maybe you have more pride in one or the other, or maybe you have more sense memory with one, or maybe it just you felt it more, if that makes sense. Or no, is that just irrelevant?
Well, when you walk into a shoot like that, both of those were very low production value shoots. I just had one assistant. So there's not a lot of resources there. It's not like I didn't have, in other words, like I didn't have a hair and makeup person or a wardrobe person for either of those shoots. And so you're kind of at the mercy of just what's going to happen. So the best you could do is like arrange furniture, open up a space, maybe open a curtain as we did in the Bushes case. And then with the case of with James and Mary, it was a challenge. There was not an art director there either. So, I'm trying to make decisions of what James should wear. I think he was going to at first wear like an LSU cap and like a t-shirt. Mm-hmm. And I was like,
for the cover of his book.
Yeah. I was like, no, let's move towards this being, maybe you should wear this. What are some options? Anyway, like you're to some degree, you're kind of dealt what you're dealt. And I felt like it was probably, the Bush photo came together more organically. Mm-hmm. Just like anything, sometimes things are, they happen and they're more fluid. Other times you just have to kind of hammer at them. So much about photography is problem solving. And so you just try to break it down into its parts for a shot like that when there's a real specific purpose. Mm-hmm. And think about like, how you can, if not make it great, at least make it better. And that might be like just blocking light or trying to reflect something here or put something in the background here, or just, deal with the way that someone's holding their hand or whatever. Like try to pay attention to all those little details that collectively make up the mood of a photo.
So it was less about the experience and more about just the materials, basically.
I guess
the materials being the people too, but what you had to work with.
Yeah, I don't know that they seem wildly different, except that one just happened to come together in my mind much more easily.
Yeah. Well, Jody, thank you so much for talking to me about the craft of photography today. It has been great, my friend.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Jody Horton's photography can be found on his website and by following him on Instagram. For links and other info, please check out this episode's show notes page at vickiehowell.com/craftish. Craftish is produced in Austin, Texas by me and mixed and edited by Dave Campbell. And if you like this podcast, please make sure you're subscribed on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud so that you don't miss an episode. And we'd also love it if you'd leave us a comment, rating, or review. And thank you so much to those of you who already have. Your kind words have been the fuel to feed the production of this show. We truly appreciate it. Tune into the next episode of Craftish with my guest, the iconic British knitwear designer and entrepreneur, Erica Knight. That'll go live on Tuesday. Until next time, take time to make something. Cultivate your craft. I promise you'll feel better for it. Breathe in, craft out.